Welcome to this month's Biomimicry Fireside Chat. I'm Lexa Moray, Communications Director at the Biomimicry Institute. I'm so grateful to greet you all here today in this virtual space. It's a new and important practice for us at the Institute to recognize the lands of Indigenous people in which we stand upon. While we're all calling in from different areas around the globe, I would like to personally acknowledge that I am on the traditional land of the Kanaka Oiwi people. The natives here trace their ancestry back to early Polynesian settlers of Hawaii, and it's with great respect that I honor this land. Today, we're going to dive into a conversation on biomimicry and how we can take a lesson from agriculture and improving the fashion industry. Both industries have traditionally been shackled to petroleum. We brought together some differing opinions and approaches with our speakers today, but the underlying intention for everyone is the same: regeneration. Leading us through this revolutionary conversation on the nature of fashion, moving toward a regenerative model, is our special guest panel. Welcome, Rebekah Burgess, Executive Director of Fibershed. And greetings to Ricardo Goray, the AgriLoop Project Coordinator at Circular Systems. Say hello to Chris Kirsten, Chief Commercial Officer of the Land to Market Program at the Savory Institute. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Beth Ratner, the Executive Director here at the Biomimicry Institute. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for being with us here today.
Thank you for hosting us. Appreciate this opportunity.
Oh, I couldn't unmute for a second there, but now I can.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Perfect. I panicked, but we recovered. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited that you guys are here. You are three of my favorites. And just for everybody who's listening, we did a report for the fashion industry for a group called the Loudest Foundation, who was formerly the CNA Foundation. And you can find that report on our website. And that's how I got to meet these three very special people. So I'm just by way of a quick introduction, I'm going to let each one of them introduce themselves first, but just my little thoughtful detail about them. Rebekah Burgess got to meet, she lives here in Marin. I'm pointing as if you can see where she lives, but you cannot. It's right here, it's right over here. Really influenced by the Pomo and Miwok in terms of her personal traditions and what she brings to Fibershed. I've been immensely impressed by that work. When we found her book, I felt like we found this North Star of what was possible for fashion. And her own practices with collecting indigo and sharing it just really personally inspire me. So I think I'll let Rebekah introduce herself and then I'll go to the others.
Thank you, Beth. That was generous. And fellow Marinite, thank you. So my name is, as mentioned, Rebekah Burgess, founder of Fibershed and currently running the nonprofit organization Fibershed as the executive director. Very grateful for opportunities to work with producer members, so farmers and ranchers, contract grazers, and small manufacturers, natural dyers, felters, knitters, weavers, in this 51 county region that we organize within. And we organize based on some of the forces of politics, economics, geomorphology. We kind of organize around these ideas of how we can build regional economies that clothe human people in our community. So we call it soil to soil. And I look forward to chatting more about that in this conversation today. And oh, should I pass it to the next person? Chris. Oh, is Chris frozen? Ricardo, maybe. Ricardo, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sorry, hey Lex, if you can hear me, can you just make it so that I can keep muting and unmuting? For some reason, every time I hit mute, I can't unmute again. So sorry to tell you.
Yeah, Beth, you should be all good now.
Thank you. All right, now I'm going to be good. Thanks, Rebekah. So Chris, my thoughtful comment about you is that you and your family live on burnt land here in Northern California, and you see that as an opportunity, not as a burden, and that you're working to regenerate that land. And in the process, you've also you're just one of the most thoughtful and well-spoken people about soil and the role of animals that I've ever met. And you throw in French terms like "welcome to my milieu" into like a casual conversation. So with that, Chris Kirsten.
Thank you, Beth. Yeah, I am that enigma. Yeah, people tend to know us as the regenerative grazing people, but in the last couple of years, we've been scaling up a global outcome-based measurement protocol that measures soil health and carbon and water and biodiversity. We've measured 2 million acres around the globe, and now we're working with brands to help them be able to take advantage of that. We have kind of a wraparound package that we kind of call supply, science, and story to help bring regenerative products to the marketplace. So I lead that market side of the program, and you're right, our home burned in 2018, and we decided that as refugees of climate change in a very wealthy and privileged country, that we were going to dedicate our lives to going back on the land and healing it and being part of the solution more than ever before. There was a real inherent irony in that we had already, my wife and I, dedicated our lives to solving the world's biggest problems through regenerative agriculture, but to be living it on the front lines now is a little bit different perspective. So we're more committed than ever, and so excited to be here with you guys today and talking more about these important issues.
Thanks, Chris. Ricardo is also a California native, but has lived all over the world and visited all over, from Japan to Guatemala to New Zealand and Spain, and always working with producers and also designers. And in the process, he also a few years ago worked with the UN, actually with the Fashion Summit in Copenhagen, to create the first UN resolution around fashion, which I think is incredibly important. So welcome, Ricardo.
Oh, thank you, Beth. And Chris, what you just shared, I think that's really a testament to what we can really do if we commit ourselves. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, my name is Ricardo Garay. Originally from California, currently based in Berlin. The work that I get to do at Circular Systems combines my two loves, my two backgrounds, my background in regenerative agriculture, caring about the soil and our agricultural systems, as well as my background in design and fashion, and focused on circular textiles. And so the work that I engage with every day is kind of bridging the gaps between farmers, consumers, and brands, and helping to form bridges of communication between them. And I get to, on one day, work more on the LCA, on the type of co-products that we're producing with the AgriLoop, as well as talking to some of the biggest brands and talking about their supply chain needs. So I feel very fortunate that I get to have these conversations.
Thanks, Ricardo. With that, I just want to turn really quickly to the way that I met the three of you was through the Nature of Fashion report that we did with Loudis. And for those of you who haven't yet read it, and again, it's on our website, but it was really kind of appealing back to, we got asked this question by Loudis, and we in turn asked you three the same question, which is, if fashion were to operate like an ecosystem, what would it have to do? And for us, we kind of peeled it back to what Janine and I who were just talking the other night. Hi, Janine, by the way, I think she's listening today. It's kind of the first pages out of the biology book, which is that there's a triad here of primary producers, consumers, and decomposers. And that whole system is powered by the sun, and it works on entropy. And as long as we fight dispersal, we fight entropy, then we're just going to continue to lose, basically, as a culture. And in that process, we sort of discovered that we had to go back to these natural, biological, biocompatible fiber systems. And that was how I got to interview each one of you. And so my first question is actually for you, Ricardo, which is, in the spirit of so we read 1,000 reports. Okay, we probably read like 50, but it felt like 1,000 reports. And in that process, recycled polyester continued to come up as the greenest fiber. And that didn't jive at all with this kind of like triad of how biology works. And so I ask you, Ricardo, how do we do this? Like, how do we, understanding that this fashion system continues to look at recycled polyester as the greenest material, sort of, how are we going to address that?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Beth. I think essentially what's easy for people to think about with polyester is that we have the infrastructure already established to recycle it. So when you look at it from the outside, it does look like it is an example of a circular material because we can recycle it somewhat readily, and we understand that, and the infrastructure to then re-extrude it and to spin it again is already established, and that's kind of a testament to humankind, to really say, look, we wanted to solve this cycling problem, and we established the infrastructure to do that. So in a way, we are mimicking nature. We are trying to establish these cycles. We're just doing it with the wrong material. So at Circular Systems, we do use recycled polyester because a lot of the brands that we work with demand it from a performance perspective. But we look at it as kind of a medium-term solution while we find other solutions that come from rapidly renewable resources that are biodegradable, that aren't going to have these microfragment pollution problems that we have with polyester and with nylon and with others. So we're kind of, every solution that we try to focus on at Circular Systems, we look at it as different phases, and it is a solution for now, but we know it's not the long-term solution. But you're exactly right. It's hard to imagine that polyester ranks so highly on so many of these reports and databases. And I think we're just asking the wrong kinds of questions, and we're oftentimes letting performance and the readily available infrastructure dictate what materials we use instead of asking what we need on our bodies and within our communities.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I love that answer. And Chris, that kind of fits right into your bailiwick, which is, so the reason why recycled polyester also comes up all the time is because of cost. Oops, Chris, are you frozen? Can you move around a little bit? Oh no, Chris is there. Okay.
Oh, okay.
I swear it looked like you were sleeping, Chris.
I'm gonna turn my camera off just for 1 second and see if that helps.
Okay, I'm gonna ask Rebekah a question instead then. So Rebekah, kind of back to Ricardo's point as well, is, so not long ago we were entirely a natural fiber system, maybe even just 60 years ago. How do we look at the mountains of polyester that exist today and just say, like, I'm gonna not look at that, I'm gonna forget about that, and I'm gonna return to this natural fiber system? How is it really possible to have local fiber sheds the way that you describe in your book?
Well, I was happily surprised to to evaluate our supply. Actually, Ricardo was a critical part of us evaluating our wool supply in California back in, was that 2012 or 13?
Yeah, I think it was 11, or was it 12? Yeah, sometime around then.
So when Ricardo was at UC Davis, part of a capstone program, his capstone group really pushed their food-centric professor to evaluate fiber systems in a sustainable food systems course. And they went on the landscape and supported staff members at Fibershed to go to sheep shearers and give them self-addressed envelopes with little data sets, like tell us how many sheep you sheared, what the quality is, and send us in this little coin envelope a sample of the wool. So we did the first qualitative and quantitative analysis of wool, meaning we didn't just know how much wool, we knew exactly what the micron count was for the entire state. And I think we got like over 60% of all producers. And so our sample size for micron was really indicative of what's on the land. And I was like, oh, we just found out this year, especially, California is the largest wool producer in the United States. We also found out we produce 439 million pounds of long staple Pima cotton every year. Right now, without us trying to be a fiber shed, without anyone attempting to do anything different to the agricultural landscape, no intentionality here on local or regional economic development, just this is our raw production capacity. So that's like 11 pounds of cotton per Californian per year, which is actually a lot. Like, you don't need that much. And the quality at which we produce is extra long staples. So it's extremely fine quality. You got bed sheets and towels, everything you need is grown on this land already naturally. Of course, cotton has a lot of system aspects to the system which need to be evaluated and refined. Like there's huge work to do in cotton, but it's here and the work can be done if we put our attention on it. So fiber sheds being possible, it's more like they're kind of already here. We're just not appreciating them and we're not giving them their fair shake at value-added systems. Like we keep assuming that we can live in these kind of colonial economies where whole countries produce raw material and then whole other countries add value, and farmers never see the ability to gain economic mobility around their raw production cycles because we export at the raw commodity prices and the prices are set globally. So not only do we already have fiber sheds, we essentially need them, I think, to stabilize rural economies. I don't think we can continue on this path of exploitation of land and labor. And just under these current social unrest conditions, people aren't going to tolerate what's going on in these systems. And the only way I see it through these systems is allowing the raw material producers to be part of the means of production, to have cooperatively owned mills, to have mills that cycle dividends of profit back. Because right now, the variation between what the farmers make and their margins, and I love textile brands, I work with some of the largest, 400% markups between when it gets cut and sewn to when it gets to the retail outlet or the online store. So there's just such a disparity in how people are living across the value chain. So I think we need more transparency and support and regionalization so we can have more transparency. Regionalization actually allows everybody to get to know the supply chain for reals.
For real. That's actually a perfect setup for my question for Chris. I was going to ask you later in the conversation, but first I just wanted to say, so tell me a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about how Savory fits into the model that Rebekah just described, and then also speak to regionalization.
Yeah, there's kind of a perfect storm that's been emerging, and there's been so much work put behind this. I mean, we started getting going on this journey in 2011. These guys are talking about, back to 2012, 2011 on their projects. Like none of this has been easy. It's been this gradient of difficulty, if you will, but there's this perfect storm that's emerging, that's starting to bubble up. We've got consumers awakening, and lo and behold, they prefer to wear natural products over oil. Who would have ever guessed? And we've got these compliance regulatory issues starting to come into their own, of business really stepping into being a force for good. You've got the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris talks as really a watershed moment. People are connecting over shared values like never before, and the business world is trying to find their way into that. There's also this kind of emerging thread of true cost accounting that brands should be held accountable for more of their impact. So if they're going to, many of your first movers and early adopters are saying, how do we be a part of leading the way in that, knowing that we're going to have to do it later, that the society is going to hold us to that accountability of these negative impacts that are part of our value chain. Why don't we proactively start fixing them now? So I don't want to say any of this as though it's been easier without strife or effort. Sometimes I think of our work at Savory as kind of and I know it's the same with Rebekah and Ricardo here, that we're the kind of people that if somebody says it's impossible, it's almost a driving force that we have to get that done. Society depends on this. We can't not do it just because people say it's too hard. Because there's a lot of work in what I'm about to say, but we're kind of starting to have our day in the sun, and we've got, like I said, our EOV program that measures land health, and then we can take products coming off of that land and start to segregate it through supply chains. And we've got a product that just launched with Timberland at the beginning of this month. It's a new pair of leather boots, all coming off of verified regenerative landscapes in a time when people said transparency can't be done and regenerative can't be measured. Like we've made some headway on this. It's starting at critical mass. Eileen Fisher, that their brand, 85% of their wool is coming through our program, through this land to market program. We've got products in the work with Caring Group that owns Gucci and Balenciaga and Saint Laurent. We work with them on helping to launch their biodiversity standards this year. We just signed a long-term agreement with UGG and Decker, particularly to start working on some of UGG's innovation and lamb leather sourcing. So it's really all starting to come to kind of a critical mass and get moving. We're at a tipping point, if you will, if you want to Malcolm Gladwell this. We're kind of moving into this new paradigm, which is super
Hey, wait, Chris,
exciting.
I'm going to interrupt for just a quick second. By the way, because you're in a loud spot, if you can hold up your mic, that would be great.
Like this? Is this helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. And then in terms of regionalization, I agree 1,000% with everything that Rebekah just said. But there's some complexity and some nuance to this that has to be addressed too. So yes, every time we can have local first, of course, I would totally support that. At the same time, though, we have to think about where and how populations have moved. We've moved populations in most countries to the coast, and that's certainly true here in the United States. And we've gotten more urbanized. And so we're getting more and more concentrated and further away from our land bases. So if you think of countries that in this archaic colonial paradigm, if you think of like New Zealand, Ireland, Uruguay, Argentina, places that have more production than they have people, we have to think about how we can engage those resources into global needs. And there are opportunities of environmental efficiencies that can occur that, I one time talked to a rancher that was taking more of an LCA approach, and he said, there's less fuel emissions to get a load of cattle, grass-fed cattle from New Zealand to California than there was to get 2 truckloads from Oregon to California. And so there are efficiencies. We would know this instantly in a city if we were thinking about mass transit. We would say, why should everybody have their own car? We should put them all on the same bus or the same train or the same light rail. So there are efficiencies there, and I think it's very much human nature to demonize things into the good guys and the bad guys, to try to get it to binary extremes. And I think that sometimes we lose opportunity in the middle. So I would say, yes, local first. And I would say processing where production happens is key. So if we can get fiber sheds today, when we're talking about textile and apparel, if we can get fiber sheds happening in these regions so that those farmers are able to get more on the value chain before it goes on the boat, to me, I see a tremendous amount of opportunity in that. And then as time goes on, I think we as a society need to think about, do we repopulate these lands that have been deserted by people, and what does that look like in how we design society?
It's such a complicated question, and I would love to see like a group of people help to map where that sweet spot is between regionalization versus maybe centralized efficiencies for global economies. It's a hard question, and so pivoting a little bit, Rebekah, one of the things that I saw in the WRI report was that there's 2 billion hectares of degraded land across the across the world. And one of the things that you said to me one time was, well, we could just leave it alone and nature would eventually restore it, maybe a few hundred years from now, maybe even longer, or we can get in there and we can restore it maybe a couple decades, maybe less. And I was wondering to what extent your work with fiber production, it has maybe regenerative ag or soil at the heart of it, or if it's, maybe just talk a little bit about that issue of degraded land.
Well, most of the ag lands, unfortunately, that we work with have lost a critical mass of what we would call the fuel for all the micro communities or the food source, but they've lost the carbon that kind of makes the whole system move. So I think it was Dr. Wendy Silver did an analysis, and with Marcia Delange, who now works at Union of Concerned Scientists, on an assessment of California rangeland. So 63 million hectares of our rangeland, which is grazed in most cases, has lost over half the carbon. We see soils that should have between 11 and 12%. I mean, just due to valley bottom lands, alluvial floodplains, should have 11 to 12% soil organic matter, half of that being carbon. And now some of these landscapes that are in irrigated crop systems in the San Joaquin Valley are below 1% soil organic matter, like 0.5% soil organic carbon. And I see this all through these ag lands. So I would say depleted landscapes, we're already seeing that the food producing landscapes that we're eating from have depletion occurring. Then we have landscapes that obviously have received contamination or some kind of abuse from other chemical industry, et cetera. So we have a restoration project that I would say is both in the landscapes we're currently eating and wearing from and broad scale. I don't know if this was the question where you wanted me to point to what restoration. Yeah, okay. So how I see restoration is I see including a conversation around anthropogenic diversity enhancement. So how do we mimic the natural landscape, which is always tending towards more and more life. If left alone, life creates more life, creates more life. And that ascending spiral, which we think like ecosystems are not homeostatic, they're ascending or they're descending in some state change can knock it into one way or the other. So why don't we knock the system into a state change where it's creating more life, creating more life, creating more life. And so that could be done by, in ag systems, just enhancing the amount of species that you're planting in the non-cash crop season. So, or interplanting with your cash crop, you know, 50, we see Gabe Brown and we see other, you know, yes, it's Euro settler agriculture, but it harkens back to indigenous ethnobotanical gardens that we've seen from the Amazon through California's mosaic patterns of wildflowers that were harvested for seed, for food. There's these ways of enhancing diversity by planting whatever it is. It could be the native wildflowers mixed with vetch and pea, and making sure that during some part of the year, we're covering the soil with these diverse polycultures and then grazing them down, bringing in what nature would do, would bring in the pronghorn antelope or bring in the elk or the bison. Well, maybe in this case, we don't have that all available. So we bring in the sheep and the goats and the cows and the chickens, all the species that all play their role. And then maybe we interseed like they're doing in Australia. We might interseed our cash crop while we're doing all this, like pasture cropping. We might do some of this work in rotation, dynamic rotations that take 4 and 5 years, where the cash crop changes every year, but we're interplanting and cover cropping the whole time. And always throwing in animals instead of using chemical herbicides to defoliate or chemical herbicides to squash down your polyculture cover crop before you put your cash crop in, move animals in. And all these things I'm saying, the devil's in the details. Like, I know that I work with farmers and this is complex work, but there are, the Haggertys in Australia are doing this work of pasture cropping using sheep, growing grain and growing native grasses that photosynthesize during the summer. I could see us throwing hemp in that mix. I could see us throwing flax in that mix. Those dynamic rotations that I described could take a few years to foresee all the benefits from. Hemp, flax, tomatoes, cotton, wheat, barley. We have that opportunity to create a yield out of this restoration project, and a yield that then could go into the agri-loop systems that Ricardo is pioneering with Isaac, which I can't wait to hear more about. And those kinds of fibers that come off these systems have this potential to be turned into cellulosic textile, and not the cellulose, I mean, tensile, modal, I know birch trees, eucalyptus, I know that's the big thing, but I'm also just kind of like, why trees? Like, why not use a lower hanging fruit, like just some herbaceous species that you can just broadacre seed as you're restoring degraded land and building carbon. And it's just part of this much simpler harvest process, much less fossil fuel intensive, much less chemistry.
And I know there's a punchline too. Like, you've done kind of a projection. What's the number? 23
billion 1-pound garments could come off of a wheat hemp rotation alone in the United States. That's a 56 million acre assessment. So that's how much wheat is growing on conventional farmland in the US, a lot of it degraded, there's no animal integration. In the Hunter Valley in Australia, they did show that a hemp and wheat rotation increased yields of wheat, sometimes up to 20%. So it's a very natural way of cycling those two crops together over time. And so if hemp then becomes, well, in Ricardo, they're using the seed. he can talk more about that, but if you use
Yeah.
a seed varietal, you can have maybe perhaps a food source, or you're producing an oil crop, and then you also have the remaining biomass for a textile, and then you're growing wheat in the same field in the other part of the year. And then the 23 1 billion pound garments that we can get from that wheat hemp cycle in the United States, that doesn't take into account if we mow it down with sheep and goats. And then we could possibly have lamb. So if you eat meat, you would have access to a grass-fed and finished, hopefully, lamb product. You could have wool, and then you could also potentially have a dairy project if those sheep were being milked, if that was part of the system. So again, I think we need to think about how 1 acre of land can be restored and stack as many material functions off that land as possible, which is kind of very oppositional to current thinking. Animals here, cropland here.
Exactly. Food
Value chain over here.
No, it's so good. And actually you teed up Ricardo really beautifully. And so I'm going to have you just explain, because you're at the other end of the system where there's tremendous amount of ag waste being burned. And you've decided that that's actually a feedstock. You want to just talk about that?
Yeah, I think Rebekah just mentioned exactly one of the things that we would love to see happen, not just in the US, but globally, this idea that we can really increase the value of the seed and also the plant material. So namely with the bast fibers that we look at with hemp and flax being the primary ones, the biggest hurdle there is that typically you as a farmer have to kind of choose when you harvest, because if you let it go all the way to seed, the stalk of the material, it becomes quite lignified, and all those lignins make it really difficult to remove, and that maturity of that stalk is more, it's been one of the biggest hurdles for the textile industry for quite some time. So what we've tried to do is create a system that allows us to utilize the mature stalks. So we're able to utilize the seed as well as the plant material, the biomass. And so that's part of this idea that if we can do that and maximize the arable land use, and we can really extract not just the nutritional value, but also the medicinal value of the different plants that we're working with as well, that we're really going to see these impacts that Rebekah is talking about, and stacking that. I love that visual, the spiraling up. I think that's certainly what biomimicry is all about. And so that's what we really envision with the AgriLoop system. It's a mini mill system that's supposed to utilize the raw materials of any given bioregion, so that it's designed to be modular from the outset. So depending upon the raw materials that are accessible in the region, we can change the front end, so the material handling side, to be able to process that material. And so what I like about it is similar to nature, where we have a wide variety of different inputs, so increasing that diversity and creating a wide variety of outputs as well. So our primary product is the biofiber, the new natural fibers as we refer to it. But the co-product of the system is also a fertilizer, because our CTO, Yitzhak Goldstein, the inventor of the AgriLoop, really believes in good chemistry in, good chemistry out. And so by aligning our textile processing system to be in harmony with our soil systems and what the soil needs, we're able to create a chemical system that is utilizing the biomass itself to actually refine the fiber. And so that's kind of the next iteration, but for now we're purchasing those biochemicals off the open market in the first iteration of the system. But it still allows us to do this real proof of concept that our wastewater is actually nutrient rich. And so we're able to extract those biosolids and reapply them to the field. So we're in the process of doing the LCA for that, and in the process of doing all those testings. And it's been a really amazing project to be a part of, but there's definitely some work ahead. But by viewing these little modular systems, we can really maximize the resources, really maximize the value added products, and make sure that revenue is getting back to the farmers as well. So trying to close that disparity that Rebekah was also talking about in the beginning. it just doesn't make sense that farmers have to go through all of this, jump through these hurdles to be able to just, they don't get any of that income back from the actual straw. And so to answer your question, typically that has such low value that it's actually being burnt. So if we look at in the North America, like in the Canadian prairies, there's so much flax and hemp that's being burned. It's just obscene, and all that value is just being vaporized. And on top of that, it poses a huge human health risk, on top of the fact that it's affecting our climate. So if we can really change that perspective and reevaluate, then we're going to be able to drive that regenerative mindset.
I love that. Chris, you rattled off some really impressive brands earlier, and I'm just wondering if you could kind of, two things. One, can you go back to why now? You know, why are the brands paying attention to savory and regenerative practices overall? And maybe tell us a success story, a quick success story.
Sure. So, yeah, the why now part, I think, actually makes more sense to start with the other end of the value chain. So, you know, the whole world is kind of awakening to this notion that soil can be the solution to some of our biggest problems: climate change, water insecurity, food shortages, struggling rural economies. And in this, we're starting to come to the conclusion that the farmer is the ambassador to this solution then. And if that's the case, then we need to change their standard of their role in society, that up to this point, they've always been relegated to the peasant class. And so if we're going to think of them as the solution area, it's really time to celebrate them as such. On the other end of the chain, you've got consumers that have always been given the least amount of information to close the sale. You know, and so we've really had the wool pulled over their eyes, to use a pun about what we're talking about today. I think for the first time maybe in history, brands are getting pressure from both sides and seeing there's an opportunity for them to play the role of connective tissue in between those two over shared values, that we're all societally, civilization is waking up to the idea that we're destroying our spaceship and there's nowhere else to go. The trip to Mars is probably not going to save us. So we've got to fix the spaceship that we're on. And so we're getting this drive to make this change in ways that hasn't happened before. At the same time, though, I really kind of, and this is my own, breaking my own rule I said earlier, of kind of putting people into two categories. I kind of drop brands into two binary options, kind of the old guard and the new paradigm. And the old guard, there's a subset of those that are really seeing that the model is broken. They see the writing on the wall. And so they're supporting a change of adapt or die. And they're investing huge amounts of energy and resources into changing. If they'll be able to, I don't know. I really don't know. The cut on the side of the Titanic is large. And whether they'll be able to be nimble enough to make change is still yet to be seen. And are we existing in the right model of economic system and how values exchange to even get there is a totally different debate. But in this time in history, they can play that role that says, I'm going to show the consumer that I care, and I'm going to deliver on that with authenticity and integrity that hasn't been done before. And I'm going to deliver new value streams and new revenue back to the farmer and celebrate them as the real rock star that's driving this ship. And if they do that, I think there's decent hope. The other category, though, is newer, smaller startups, younger brands that are really more in tune with the mission of saving society. In fact, many of them are starting for that reason. To me, I put them in a different category, that grassroots kind of bubble up, ultra nimble brand. Those are the ones that I think can change the needle really fast. They bake it in from their plans from the very beginning. We don't care necessarily so much about how much we deliver back to shareholders. We care about connecting with the largest group of people as possible and working with the best raw material providers that we can. Those kind of brands give me a ton of hope, but I think both have their role to play. But those big brands have a certain degree of atoning to do, and I think they know that. No one's unaware of this, and so it's a really interesting time in history. I don't think society's ever seen this moment before.
It is, it's converging. By the way, we're getting some really great questions. I'm going to try to integrate some of them, but we also will have a follow-up after this where we'll post the questions and we're going to ask our panelists to quickly answer them. So be sure to check back to the website if your question doesn't get answered, but we'll try to get to some of them. I'm actually going to kind of continue on the thread that you guys all started, which is what's next. And I think that it's funny, when you look in circular economy conversations, the theme that keeps coming up is reuse, right? Like, what are new traceability tools? How are we doing, whether it's reclaimed auto parts or auto leather interiors that are becoming, like, there's just this constant, there's a lot around reuse that continues to come up. From the report, I can tell you that reuse is only part of it. Of course, for the natural fibers, that would make sense, but for the polyesters, it's never gonna, ultimately, you're just prolonging the problem. And I guess, Rebekah, my first question would be to you, like, we've seen a lot of venture capital investment money into biosynthetics. And I'm wondering why you think that remains so sexy as opposed to the $60,000 investment in, milling or weaving equipment that could change a local economy. Like, how do you compare these two very different investment spaces?
Well, I think there's two reasons. One is just intrinsic human nature to get very attracted to shiny things. And it's just something that we do. I remember going to a retreat in Indonesia, a Buddhist retreat, and having a Rinpoche come from Tibet to discuss, like, staying on the path. And staying on the path included not being distracted by the rubies and the diamonds and the shiny things to each side of you. And I think society has become incredibly distracted by distractions, shiny things. It's natural. I think we have to catch ourselves though, and use kind of a careful self-evaluative process as we engage with technologies and these things that distract, and how do we want to engage? We should be able to ask those questions. And so I think what synthetic biology does for me is it takes out the democratic process of engagement in a way that I haven't seen another technology do in my lifetime. Similar though to BT cotton, which has now contaminated the genetics of cotton globally, or 2,4-D corn, which has contaminated all the land races in Mexico without anyone's consent. So we really have genetic pollution at a level that none of these communities that had been classically breeding corn and cotton in India and Oaxaca, for instance, for multiple millennia, they don't get a say in now that all of their species are contaminated. To me, to upset classical breeding that's been going on in indigenous communities for millennia it points to this issue of synthetic biology being the next layer of potential genetic contamination, but it's very shiny. And people will always say, oh, but all of these yeasts and all of these E. coli bacteria that we're genetically engineering, don't worry, they're all dead before we put them into the waterway. And they keep saying we've been using these technologies for some time and their sun is, they sunset and they're dead and they won't survive out in the biosphere on their own. Those are always the arguments you hear. And I just think at the same time, if you talk to microbial ecologists who don't have their paycheck coming from venture capital that's funding the technology, microbial ecologists whose bread is not buttered by the VC money, they say something very different. They say, well, actually, we know more about the dark side of the moon than we do about the microbial world. The microbial world is completely new to most of us who have been studying it for decades. So why go into something that you know almost nothing about and start engineering it before you've mapped it completely?
I love that. That isn't that often the case, right? We get so distracted so quickly. I love that. I love that meditation actually that you gave us. That's important. Ricardo, in terms of, so again, in the theme of what's next, how are we going to transition these economies to serving traditionally underserved people? How are we going to see a job recovery program that's also tied to a soil recovery program?
Well, I think our perspective with the AgriLoop, again, going back to this idea that an agri-loop facility is intended to be a part of the community. So very much in the same efforts and vein of thought as Fibershed, trying to understand the needs of the community and trying to service those needs. So we really intend that these joint ventures that we establish, that they're really owned by the communities that we're working with and engaging with, hopefully by the farmers that we're working with, that we develop systems and infrastructure that support new job creations in these regional communities that we're so excited to finally be able to scale our technology to a point where we're able to engage with these communities, and then not so near and not so future our future. So we're so excited. It's just around the corner where we'll be able to create these modular systems that can really cycle the nutrients as well. So one of the key differences, again, of our system is, I think a lot of people are looking at waste, agricultural waste, and creating all sorts of value-added products. A lot of them are going the biosynthetic route, and that is a bit alarming. And aside from the issues that Rebekah just pointed out, the other side of the coin is that they're not thinking about the nutrient cycle. So they're taking all of this biomass and they're not thinking about the nutrients that need to be put back onto that field. So we're exposing ourselves to a world where we'll need to replenish those nutrients one way or another, and more than likely they'll have to come from chemical sources. So we really have to design our systems from the outset to service the needs of the communities and also to utilize the raw materials that are prevalent. And unfortunately, we've designed the world, and also fortunately, we've designed a world that has an abundance of waste. So if we can change that mindset, we can actually drive a lot of positive growth. And when I say growth, I mean growth that not from this false understanding of value and GDP and just getting more money to people that don't necessarily don't live with the rest of us, I would say. But yeah, I mean growth from soil perspective and from well-being, and from the fact that we're just generating better livelihoods for the communities that we're working with. So that's our mission, and that's what we're so excited to be working with Rebekah and with Chris to think about these thought experiments and actually create the targets in the pilot programs to actually get the work done, to measure and to set a path for us to actually have these tangible products in hand.
Thanks, Ricardo. Chris, did you want to add to that anything about the future of jobs and land?
Yeah, I think we're creating new opportunities that haven't been defined yet, and so for those that,
hey Chris, can you hold your mic up?
Oh, sorry. For those that like, co-creation and new design, which I'm sure is nothing unique to the biomimicry community, it's a really exciting time. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot we could spend time talking about what's wrong with the world, but there's at the same time that, not to wordsmith this or just to put it into a fresh light, but there really truly is more opportunity than we've ever had before. And so recognizing that opportunity, being able to embrace it, the time is now. And so I'm highly optimistic about the future, despite all that's wrong and should be better.
God bless you. That's amazing. I love hearing that, Chris. So look, petroleum is subsidized. Farm bill is a subsidy that goes toward an entirely different kind of system than what we're talking about today. If you were, crown and scepter is yours, I'm going to ask each of you this question. We'll start with you, Rebekah, but you get to make governmental policy happen to enable the systems that you've been fighting so hard to achieve. What are the key pivotal things that have to happen to make this work?
Well, if we started with the Farm Bill and just the current structures that exist, for instance, in the United States, I would undergird the Environmental Quality and Incentives Program that's part of the Natural Resource Conservation Service. I would provide the EQIP program with a quadrupling or a quintupling of its funding, and I would make sure that we return to the old version, which came out of FDR, the idea of a soil conservation service, not just a natural resource conservation service, but we pivot towards a focus on building soil through that institution that was designed for that. Again, I'm just talking on the governmental side. And I know there's a lot of criticism about the effectiveness of of government. But when you strip something and then you ask it to still be effective, so I do believe in the power of policy, and I do believe in the power of a democratic government to support those basic institutions like food systems and fiber systems. I do think that the government plays a role with carrots and sticks in that space. And in an effective carrot and sticks design, we could empower and enable this idea of soil carbon building regenerative ag systems at scale on existing farmland. And we could also stop the pillage of intact ecosystems through the Farm Bill, which also incentivizes farmers to grow, as we know, soy and corn for ethanol production, et cetera. We could transition the kinds of crops that we're growing. So then we have different services we're providing. More nutrient dense food systems could evolve out of a different Farm Bill. More diverse and interesting fiber systems could evolve out of a retrofitted Farm Bill. The other program I would really focus on is when the 1930s Dust Bowl occurred, FDR knew that he couldn't manage conservation and restoration of the landscape from DC. So he empowered regional districts to design their own board of directors, and they called them resource conservation districts, or that's what they call them in California. And I think about what kind of place-based organizing around soil. Should we amplify the role of the historic resource conservation districts? Should we refund them with some general operating funds? They have no general operating funds. Some of them have one employee for 1 million square acres. But they're generally the districts that pull the money in from the state, and they pull the money in from the feds and direct it towards a riparian corridor restoration or a critical planting area, or they put in the solar powered water system so you can do adaptive managed grazing. They actually play a critical role, and they are place-based districts. So I would say give them general operating funds, and that's also a held policy statement by the Carbon Cycle Institute, by the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts. And again, these resource conservation districts are across the country. They've been latent, they've fallen asleep in some cases, and they've disappeared. But I do think on a governmental side, we have ability to rebirth and blow life into that system again. So that would be, I'm sure Chris and Ricardo can talk on the market side, what they'd like to see. I have dreams there too, but I will stop there.
Thanks, Rebekah. That's great. Ricardo, do you want to go?
I'm just still thinking about what that would look like from a regional organizing on soil. That I like that vision. I think from the market side, where I would begin with restructuring this idea of the way that we connect to the communities. So like oftentimes we're thinking about the products as separate from our supply chains and separate from the farm, where we look at them as completely disparate areas of just completely separate from one another. And so I think one of the biggest things that we can really focus on with, for instance, in California, is more of this this idea that if the place is going to have this unique opportunity to tell its own story, we can really hit that home, and we can really get brands excited, we can get communities excited, we can get I'm fascinated by the opportunity of place and what this can have when it comes to our soil systems and what it can have in the products that we're creating. And so with the AgriLoop, this really honestly can be hopefully something that's driven from the community perspective in this organizing. I'll stop there, but I think mostly I'm just excited about this opportunity that's forming, the time that's occurring.
Thanks, Ricardo.
Yeah.
Chris, what's the biggest force?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I would overhaul government subsidies to be based on ecosystem services, so the positive benefits that landowners are providing to society. That's what subsidies should be based on. So in essence, you're paying to incentivize regenerative, and there's real benefit to this for the bureaucrats. If you look at the money that gets spent after the fact on the disasters, the floods, the fires, the droughts, the insurance, all of that, if we can show on the front end that we can mitigate even a small amount of money from that big pool on the other side on preventative mitigation on the front side, all of a sudden creates huge changes, massive signal changes. So I'd start there. I would allow those farmers to create ecosystem service units that could, or credits that could still get sold in the marketplace so that brands could start to engage and further incentivize that. I would, I'm going to go all policy to jump out of the milieu that I normally swim in. I would like to see ways that we're incentivizing regional production first, and that those that are pulling a product from outside of a region pay an additional fee on top of that that goes back to the region where it came from, to further incentivize this and drive this. And then my personal big, hairy, audacious goal that's a little bit out there is, for some people, not for me, and I mean, I don't think it'll scare this crowd, but would be a currency based on nature, a nature-backed currency. I think that's, if we're really going to look at how wealth is created, how we're creating a safe society, how we're going to have a balance sheet between us for goods and services exchange, taking care of our house, what could be a better backing for that? So to see, and you know, you can get, you know, whether you want that to be, you know, crypto based, I don't have a problem with that. But that's where I would start to play with things, is on that currency side. To me, that's when we really get to mass appeal and kind of next level in this whole deal.
Love it. Love it. Lex is back, which means we're out of time. Do I have time to say thank you to everybody?
Of course.
Thank you, everybody. Amazing conversation. I really feel like this could go on for a while, and we could figure it all out, you know, in like 2 or 3 hours. Thank you for being part of this conversation, for your continued work, and for your contribution on the report that, by the way, continues to get a lot of ripple effects. So you guys all really influenced that.
Yes, it's really incredible. I'm still surprised how quickly an hour goes. There's been so many great resources shared, the conversations going on. I've gotten a lot of interest for following, you know, we've got so many questions that weren't answered. So we're going to try to do our best to get to them. It's really incredible to see how each person here, all the speakers you guys play such an integral puzzle piece to practicing biomimicry and regenerative ag and fashion. And clearly we need to get back to the biological world and understand how it works so we can better fit in. And fun fact, can't go without saying this, there are more soil microorganisms in a teaspoon of healthy soil than there are people on Earth. So next month, we're going to dive into this deeper for our next Biomimicry Fireside Chat. So stay tuned for the announcement coming next week. And for that list coming out, make sure you're on our newsletter, because that's how we'll send these follow-up resources. And of course, give the Nature of Fashion new report a read. We'll include a link with that along with their recording as well. Thank you all for being with us here today. And a big special thank you to Chris, Rebekah, Ricardo, and Beth.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.